But tonight, we're going to learn about Durham boats. You know, a lot of people know a lot about the Erie Canal and the packet boats that were here in the later years, more recent times. But prior to the construction of the Erie Canal, Durham boats were the primary cargo carrying vessels of the region's waterway, Mohawk River, Wood Creek. The boats could transport more than 20 tons along the river. And for a long time, we really didn't know much about them. But we're pleased to bring Ben Ford. He's the chair of anthropology department and a professor specializing in maritime historical archaeology at Indiana University in Pennsylvania. Registered professional archaeologist, 2015 Archaeological Institute of America McCann Target underwater archaeology lecturer. And his current research focuses on 18th century connections across the Mid-Atlantic region, including historic Hannahstown, the first British county seat in the Allegheny Mountains, Fort Necessity National Battlefield, as well as underwater archaeology work, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. That's a mouthful, Ben. It was my great pleasure. We can turn it over to you.
Good. Thanks, Patrick. Let me go ahead and share my screen here.
Please do. There we go.
Hopefully that's coming up on your guys' side here.
Good.
Great. So, again, I'm Ben Ford, and I'll just sort of launch into this here. And thinking about Durham boats and thinking about this talk, I reread David Hackett Fisher's sort of historical account of Washington crossing the Delaware. And if you're interested in that period and haven't read it, it's a really good book. But he starts out the book by talking starts out the same ways I want to start out with, which is with this painting by Emanuel Leutze here. And Fisher does his own thing with it, right? He sort of dissects it in terms of the diverse, parties that were involved in the American Revolution, many of which are sort of shown here in the boat with Washington. He has a bit of fun trying to debunk the debunkers about standing up in the boat. But what I want to do is focus specifically on the boat that these folks are standing in and trying to make it across the Delaware in. And just from the outset here, just say definitively that this is not a particularly accurate depiction of a Durham boat. Durham boats were one of the main types of vessel that Washington used in his crossing of the Delaware, but that is not what we're seeing here. At a minimum, it's way too short and both ends are wrong. But having said that, until pretty recently, we didn't have a good idea. We didn't have hard evidence for what Durham boats really looked like. So part of the talk tonight will be, talking about what Durham boats actually looked like. And also in thinking about Fisher's book, he goes on for 500 pages about crossing the Delaware. I mean, the man writes prolifically. But of that 500 pages, less than a page is actually describing Durham boats. And he acknowledges how important they were and how pivotal they were to the crossing, but he doesn't have much to say about it. And in part, that's because we didn't know much until pretty recently. And part of that is that Durham boats were essentially the semi-tractor trailer of their day. They were used for hauling large sort of bulk cargoes. And they were ubiquitous. And just like semi-tractor trailers today, they didn't get much notice in the historical record. People, you guys don't go home and write in your diaries about the semi-tractor trailer you saw on the highway for the most part. And the same thing goes for the historical record. They just didn't write much about these boats. So the other part of this talk will be talking about comparing what we do know from historical accounts to the archaeological record, to this shipwreck in Oneida Lake. And so basically just looking at this painting here, what we have is a not terribly accurate representation of a boat that played an incredibly important role in the events of Christmas Eve in 1776 with the crossing of the Delaware. But it had what I would argue was a much more important, though more mundane and longer term role in the economic development of the Mid-Atlantic and the Great Lakes region. So kind of with that in mind, what I'll do here is switch up our title slide to somewhat less dramatic scene, but still a scene on the Delaware. So this is again a Durham boat crossing the Delaware, in this case up by the Delaware Water Gap. And this is a much more sort of common use of these boats. So with that sort of introduction there, what I'll do now is just talk a little bit about what a Durham boat was, and so that we're all on kind of the same page here. And as I mentioned in the introduction, Durham boats were basically the 18-wheelers of the 18th and 19th century. They were designed to haul large cargoes on the relatively shallow rivers of the mid-Atlantic. And they originated along the Delaware River. The name Durham boat seems to be traceable to Durham, Pennsylvania, where there was a large and fairly early iron furnace. So at least part of their initial use was likely hauling iron ore to the furnace there. What you see on the screen here is an engraving by Schultz from 1810. It's actually one of the very few detailed depictions of a Durham boat. And what you see in the foreground is a pretty big bateau, and in the background going through that wing dam is a Durham boat. And what we'll see here as we go through is actually Schultz did a really good job of documenting what these things look like. Is this actually looks a lot like the vessel that we recorded in Oneida Lake. So they start off on the Delaware River near Durham, Pennsylvania, and from there they basically spread from the Delaware to the Mohawk River and the Oswego River, up through through Oneida Lake and on the Oswego River, and then from Oswego you see them sort of moving along the shores of Lake Ontario, eventually ending up on the St. Lawrence River and on the Niagara River. And this picture from in the bottom left is actually on the St. Lawrence River, and what you see there is an early steamboat actually towing 3 Durham boats behind it. Kind of pretty close to where the St. Lawrence hits Lake Ontario. And then actually by 1820, there are Durham boats all the way out in Green Bay, because some dude from Pennsylvania moved out to Green Bay and started building Durham boats out there. And you also see them pretty much throughout Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Ontario. So they spread kind of through the Mid-Atlantic and the Great Lakes, because they're a good boat for moving large cargoes along inland waterways. They're designed for running on rivers. In broad strokes, generally the Durham boats are about 60 feet long, 8 to 10 feet wide, maybe 3 feet deep. And again, in sort of generally in the historical record, they're sort of recorded as carrying about 20 tons. At 60 feet, 10 feet wide, it's a pretty good sized boat, and they're too big to portage, right? So you're not going to pick this thing up and move it like you might pick up a canoe for sure, and maybe a bateau. But because of their sort of being pretty beamy and pretty long, they got a really nice shallow draft. They're not drawing a lot of water, and so you can run them in a foot or even sometimes less than a foot of water, which, given so the unimproved rivers of the eastern half of the United States and the Northeast during this period, is a real asset, right? So basically, you can use these ships, these boats on rivers that aren't designed to have boats on them, really. And so what you're seeing here is actually a drawing by Robert Hager. And he took the Schultz drawing that I showed you earlier and drafted out what he saw that they look like. And I have to give Hager, among a lot of other folks as we go through this talk, credit, because Hager was one of the few scholars who really seriously study the history and the design of these boats. And so his work is important in terms of thinking about these. In terms of moving a Durham boat along, they could be rowed. They had oarlocks and you could row them. They could be sailed, and you're seeing that sort of in the bottom image there, which is at Sackett's Harbor around 1815. It looks like it's probably a Durham boat in the front there based on the length of it, with 2 sails on it. So you could sail them, but more often than not, they were poled. And poling, the struck descriptions of poling is like the most miserable experience I can come up with, where basically you would take a long ash pole with a metal point on one end and what they call a button, which is just like a knot or a knob on the other end. Put the knob into your shoulder and then basically walk along the side of the boat, pushing it up the river. So this poling was used to go upriver in the shallow rivers around here. So you're just basically bodily shoving this boat and its cargo against the current up the river. And the descriptions of it sound pretty grueling. Basically the guys are like essentially crawling along the side of the boat, pushing this thing with their bodies. So that was the main way they moved these boats around. But however they're moving them, they basically allowed for the economic and agricultural development of New York, of sort of northern Pennsylvania, parts of New Jersey, and parts of Ontario. And so you could move barrels of flour or salt or potash to market. You could bring ore to furnaces. You could take finished products from the furnace to market, or you could bring finished products from the towns and from the markets to rural communities, right? So they allowed for this economic and agricultural development and even early industrial development of much of the mid-Atlantic. And again, they're the 18-wheelers of the 18th and 19th century. They're just moving these bulk and kind of heavy cargoes along what were the highways of that period, which are these rivers. And as New York and Pennsylvania and other states started to develop their canal systems, these were actually the first boats that the canals were built for. So like the Wood Creek Canal that connects Lake Oneida, the Oswego River, and the Mohawk Hudson River system together there along Wood Creek, which is arguably the earliest canal, that was designed initially for Durham boats, right? And so that thing opens in 1803, and when they sort of improve it, they're improving it for these early, essentially canal boats, which are the Durham boats. And so, what we're talking about here is, if you think about New York's sort of agricultural development and sort of the spread of people across New York, it's largely defined by the canals in the 19th century. And so what we're talking about, the Durham boat, is really the first canal in a region that was largely defined by canals. So they're historically important, okay? And they're also historically important, again, coming back to this Leutze painting, just because it's so damn striking. Washington uses Durham boats both when he retreats across the Delaware and when he returns to attack Trenton. And he uses them because they fit the need, right? These are boats that are designed for carrying large numbers, large, heavy cargoes. So putting a bunch of people in them and moving folks safely across the river, that's what the Durham boat is made for. They're also made for landing at unimproved locations. So you can just run them up on the shore, right? So if we're making an amphibious crossing and landing of the Delaware, this boat is a good fit by its design, and so they work well for that. As an aside, probably not so good for getting cannon across, just because it's hard to get the cannon into the boat. But for moving people and horses, this would have been a pretty good way to get things across. Also, Washington and his suppliers use Durham boats because they're readily available, right? They fit the need, but there were large numbers of them available along the Delaware in 1776, and so the number of them that he uses is also a reflection of just how ubiquitous they were along the Delaware in the late 1700s, right? So again, what I'm driving at here, this sort of diatribe, is that these are important, historically important vessels. But again, use that 18-wheeler analogy, they were so common that they just don't get described in detail in the historical documents. And so until pretty recently, we had no identified archaeological examples, and they don't really show up in the historical record. So we were basically just guessing when we talked about, so-and-so used a Durham boat, or there was a Durham boat here. We were sort of just guessing what they looked like, right? Because there were minimal contemporary accounts. You got a few sketches, mostly showing them above the waterline and with very little detail. And there were a few first-hand descriptions of them, but most of those are recorded from old men who worked with these boats in their youth at the end of the period when Durham boats were in use, right? So there's some records from the early 1900s that are these old-timers sort of recollecting about like the last run on a Durham boat to Philadelphia in 1850 kind of thing. So we were kind of guessing. And like, so what you see here is, again, someone's sort of guess as to what these look like. So at this point, this brings me to Tim Kaza, Tim Downing, and Chris Martin. Okay, and essentially, I was giving a talk kind of like this one in Oswego in 2012. And actually, some of the folks in the audience here were there, also giving talks. And at the time, I was sort of talking about Lake Ontario and the shipwrecks in the War of 1812, and I made this sort of offhand comment that I was talking about the large warships, but there were these smaller crafts, including Durham boats, that were instrumental in the war. After the talk, Tim Kaza and Tim Downing kind of pulled me aside and said that they thought maybe they had found a Durham boat, right? And that literally made my day. Like, it blew my mind, because if they were correct, they clearly had found something important, right? And just to sort of talk briefly about Tim, who's in the audience here and probably not going to enjoy this, but you know, Tim Kaza is really the driver with a lot of this project. You know, he likes to go shipwreck hunting. He likes to find shipwrecks, and he spends whole nights out in his boat going back and forth, looking at a side scan sonar, which in many ways is just a high-end fish finder, and looking for anything that doesn't look natural. And then he flags it, and then he goes back and he dives on it. And you know, in some respects, I think this is Tim's version of sort of fishing, right? It's very relaxing, punctuated by these moments of great excitement. And in doing this, he found this Durham boat in Oneida Lake. And I cannot highlight enough the involvement of Tim and Chris and their whole crew in this research, because, you know, these guys, they do what they do for no pay, just for the love of history, and their love of the past and their hard work and their desire to treat the archaeological sites ethically and with respect is what drove this whole project. And so on one of his trips around Oneida Lake looking for shipwrecks, Tim Kaza finds this anomaly, this weird looking thing in 2011. And in his words, I think he described it as the coolest thing he'd ever found, and he wanted to investigate it, right? And so, but he also wanted to do it right. And what that meant was getting a permit from the New York State Museum, which actually probably ties into the next talk you guys have from their director, because they give out permits to do archaeological work. And part of that is because if a shipwreck is embedded in the bottom of a lake, it actually belongs and is controlled by the state who controls those waters. There's what's called the Abandoned Shipwreck Act in the United States, which basically claims these wrecks and then deeds over their control and their management to the states. And so the state of New York owns this shipwreck, like many of the shipwrecks in New York waters. So what you're seeing on the screen here is a side scan sonar image of the Lake Oneida Durham boat, and the little white dots that are sort of punctuating the side of it, defining sort of the shape of it, are the tops of the frames sticking up out of the mud, and there's a couple of cross pieces which are thwarts sort of supporting the hull running across. And so this was the first thing that Tim found and got him sort of excited about this. And so I got involved in 2012, and then in 2013, we got a permit from the state of New York for a non-contact survey, which basically allowed us to go down, map what was there that was visible without disturbing the wreck. So it's a no touching sort of thing. And what that produced was the maps you see on the screen here. And basically a site plan, and then Tim took the site plan and sort of turned it on its side, try and think about how this thing was laying in the mud, because the stern definitely was buried deeper than the bow, so it's not laying completely flat in the bottom. And then when you overlay the drawing that Hager did based on Schultz's historical 1810 drawing, it lines up pretty nice, which is unusual in archaeology and kind of exciting. And so basically this led us to this idea that maybe this is in fact a Durham boat. And so then I did some archival research in New York and in Pennsylvania, and became increasingly convinced that what we had here was a Durham boat, right? So we wrote all this up for the state of New York and completed our original permit. And then in 2015, we applied for a second permit. And this time we had asked for a permit to excavate part of the site and to remove wood samples. And just as a bureaucratic aside, to do that work required a permit from the New York State Museum, the Corps of Engineers, the New York Office of General Services, the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, the State Historic Preservation Office, and a notice to mariners. Literally nobody does bureaucracy like New York does bureaucracy. Y'all should be proud. Nobody's sneaking anything through. And so we get all these permits in order. In the meantime, Tim and Chris, they built a work platform, which is one of my all-time favorite work platforms because it had a table bolted to it, and it had a truck storage box bolted to it with a grill in the box. This is like this is the best project I've ever been involved in. They also built an airlift, which uses the fact that air expands as it goes up through the water column as the pressure reduces to create suction as a means to excavate. And so that's what you're seeing on the left-hand side here is a schematic of the sort of the tool that Tim and Chris put together to excavate the site. They also installed a mooring block, a concrete mooring block, just off to the side of the site so that we could bring the boat up and moor the boat to that line without having to drop an anchor. Because one of the fastest ways to screw up an historic shipwreck is to drop an anchor on it and drag that anchor through it. And so this was really really proactive of them in terms of preserving this wreck and making it safe for us to work there, and really putting the wreck's well-being at the forefront of all this. Right? So what we ended up doing was excavating at the bow of the ship, at midships, and at the stern. And so you can see the mooring block off here. And so you'd come down from the dive platform to the mooring block and then follow a line. It takes you to the stern, and you can see now in this image where we sort of dug a hole at the stern. We also dug a little bit in the middle, and then we also dug at the bow and sort of excavated in these areas. And this wasn't by accident. This was to get sort of snapshots of the vessel that helped us sort of reconstruct what it looked like. Okay, and then once we had done the excavation, we recorded. So here's a picture of Tim Kaza recording, measuring the mast step on the ship. So you took measured drawings of all the pieces of the vessel. We also shot a ton of video. And by the way, when I say we in this case, I mean Tim. Just as an example, Tim shot. This is a photo from a video that Tim shot of himself doing work. So just to give you a sense of how badass this man is, he brought the camera down, put the camera up, then did some work recording himself to create a full record of what's going on here. So so we have this video, we got recordings, we have got notes. We also recorded the curvature of parts of it, because one thing that makes ships tricky is they're in 3 dimensions. And so to get sort of the curvature of the hull, both at the ends and at the sides, we put in a fiberglass rod that we could level with this little spirit level here, and then running a tape measure off of it, you can basically measure down from the tape measure to the frame here, and as you go over and down, it's sort of a Cartesian plane, right? X and Y, and so you can capture the curve of this frame that way. And so we did the same thing on the frames as on the bow and the stern, just to kind of get the shape of this whole thing. Right? And then we bring sort of all of this together, right? So we got sketches and photos and videos and all the bits and pieces. And so that's what you're seeing here. It's kind of spread out is trying to work through what this thing looked like from all these pieces of data that we have. And so basically we went from all this sort of disparate data to these 3 drawings are the primary outcome of this, right? And there's a site plan at the top here, what we call a lines drawing in the middle, and then a reconstruction drawing here at the bottom. And so this is sort of bringing it all together and trying to basically go from what is there to what it looked like when it was in use, right? So to rebuild this thing from the archaeology. And so I'll go through each of these here in a little bit more detail. So this is the site plan. In real basic terms, the stern, the back is over here, the bow is on the other end, obviously. And then there's a lot of these sort of things going across. Those are all the frames that make up sort of the structure of the hull, and then there's some other interesting bits that I'll point out kind of as we go here. So starting at the front, because why not? Starting at the stem of it, a couple things to notice that are kind of interesting. So Oneida Lake, like a lot of the Great Lakes, have zebra mussels in them. And so you can see on the stem post here where the original mud line was before we excavated, right? So there's this line right here where the zebra mussels stop. And then below that, the wood is beautiful, like it's in really good shape. So you can sort of see how annoying the zebra mussels are in terms of trying to do this because they obscure everything. I also draw your attention to the curve of the bow. It has a real sort of gentle curve to it, almost like a spoon bowl kind of bow, which would have been really good for running up onto rocks or onto the shore, right? Because if you're operating in shallow waters, sometimes you run into rocks and you don't want to smash your bow on them. And these ships were also designed to run up onto the shore and be beached at night. And so that you can see that shape in the bow. There's also this is sort of a cross section of the stem post here, and you see these sort of grooves in the side of it here in the bottom left. That's where the hull planking would have come into it, and so it would have had basically a flush line from the front of the stem along the hull planking, and that line and the shape of that what's called the rabbet, that groove, is helpful in thinking about how thick the planking was. It's about an inch thick planking. And then just a couple other things. It looks like there was some kind of tow bit on the front. There was a big through bolt through the bow. And then there's this jumble back here, which has bits of what was the deck, and a bunch of other stuff kind of falling in behind in the stem. And if we go to the other end, to the stern, the first thing you'll notice is that the stern has a much steeper angle to it, right? It's not gentle in the back. It's got it's not quite a right angle, but it's pretty steep. It still has that rabbet line where the hull planking would have come in. In the stern, there's actually some hull plank still attached to it. But this would have been helpful. Having more vertical stern would have helped kind of keep waves and whatnot from splashing in, right? It would have given you a little bit more of a deflection of the waves so you didn't get swamped from behind. Also kind of cool, there's this metal plate with a hole in it that sticks up out of the stern. And that looks like where the steering oar was attached. To control something this big in moving water, they would have had a probably almost like a 20-foot oar they stuck off the back that they used to sort of lever through the water. Sort of like when you steer a canoe by moving your paddle in the water, same kind of idea, but just scaled up significantly. And those were usually sort of lightly lashed to some piece of the stern, and it looks like they put a metal plate that they could lash it to with a hole, and then the plate also acted as sort of a leverage point to help steer this thing. In the middle of the vessel, sort of kind of in this part here where we excavated sort of in midships, there is what's left of a mast step and a mast partner. So the mast step is the part it's attached to the base of the hull where the foot of the mast would have gone in, and the mast partner in this case was a big timber that went across the whole vessel that had a hole with a metal bracket in it that would have held sort of the upper part of the mast, or a little bit up on the mast. And so between the mast step and the mast partner, the mast is held in place. And a couple cool things here. One, just having this is neat because it tells us that this thing had a mast at one point, so it could have been sailed, which is good to know. Also, with this mast partner, the back side of this circular hole was actually a metal bracket, like an iron bracket that could be sort of pinned to hold. It looks like it has a hinge on it. So it appears you could have undone this and then lowered the mast down, which would have been important for going under bridges and if you're in part of a like wood creek that's wooded, things where there was overhead obstructions, this would have been handy, right? So you could have raised and lowered the mast relatively easily, depending on if you needed it or not. So again, it's kind of cool and kind of a clever part of the design of this thing. The mast is gone, and very likely if this thing sank with the mast up and any sort of sail on it, that sail would have been basically a parachute, and it would just yanked the mast out and it would have floated away. And that might be why this mast partner, which would have been probably nailed and bolted to the side of the vessel, has been sort of is kind of at a funny angle because it very well could have just gotten yanked out when this thing sank. Hypothetical. Other stuff to point out on here is the framing of it. And so again, when you dig down below the sediment line, you know, these frames are in just beautiful shape. I mean, you could see the tool marks on them, and you could get a pretty good sense of how they were put together. It had basically one frame went all the way across the bottom, and then there were two frames that were nailed to it that sort of went from halfway across out, right? So it was sort of double framed on the bottom and then single frames on the side. And another thing that should note on this, it has what's called a limber hole. This little hole in the base of it would have let water drain through so that you could basically get all the water to the back or the front of the boat to pump it out or bail it out. You weren't having to like bail every single frame pocket. You could sort of let the water run through and get it all out at one spot, which makes your life easier. And the other thing to note is that there doesn't appear to be very many nails coming through this, right? There may be one or two nails evident on each of the frames, but the planking it doesn't look like they nailed from the top down to hold the planks on. It looks like they probably nailed from the planking up into the frames to hold it in place. And then this thing also would have had decks on the ends. Both the stern and the bow have evidence of decks, and you can see that here in the photograph. These pieces that are running sort of diagonally across the photo, those are actually the frames that are the joist, the pieces of wood that would have held the deck in the stern up, and then similar ones are sort of visible in the bow, and then all kind of around this there was a lot of really broken up, really badly preserved softwood that would have been the planking that covered the decks. And at least in the stern, the deck actually had planking inside of it too, so you could put stuff in there that would have been up above any water sloshing around the bottom of the boat. So there would have been a nice sort of dry spot in the back of in the stern of the boat. Also found some artifacts. The ones we got photos here are a stoneware jug, a wooden mallet, and a wooden scoop. There were also there's a kettle, an iron kettle up in the bow, and there were lots of pieces of barrels in the back in the stern. You can sort of see in this drawing here, there's these sort of half rounds, which are some of the barrel heads, and there were barrel staves all kind of around in there. We don't bring up a lot of stuff because if anything you bring up will deteriorate if you don't take care of it. So these three artifacts went to the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum to be conserved before going to the New York State Museum. And anything you bring out of the water like this, you got to spend money and time to conserve it. And it took about 2 years for these artifacts to be properly conserved before they could go into storage at the New York State Museum. And again, they go to New York State Museum because all of this stuff belongs to the state of New York. It all is property of the state of New York and its people because of the Abandoned Shipwreck Act. But just to, kind of some things we can kind of infer from this, the mallet and the scoop were actually down, sort of looked like they were probably inside of this this sort of aft sort of cabin space underneath the deck in the stern of the boat. And actually the mallet was sort of in amongst a bunch of staves, of barrel staves, so it very well could have been just in a barrel back there. Like they may have had some water or grain or something in a barrel that they were using for the crew, and this was sort of in with them. And then the stoneware jug was actually sort of sitting on top of all of this, so there's a good chance that the stoneware jug was actually sitting on the aft deck of the Durham boat when it sank. And so there's sort of with the stratigraphy, we can start to kind of piece together how this whole thing sort of worked. Also, off to the side of the boat, you can see one here, and there's one sort of laying underneath the mast partner, this black lines. Those are setting poles. So those are the poles that would have been used to push this thing. The one that's inside the boat, actually, you could see the metal end on it. And so these were used to push the boat along. So again, so little bits and pieces of evidence all sort of pointing towards Durham boat. Also, and this is where things get a little weird. This hashed area in the middle is a pile of rock, and this is a picture of one of the rocks. They're not big. They're about an inch, inch and a half across, and it took me a while to find anyone who could identify this stuff. It actually ended up having to go to New York State, to their geologist, who then put me on to somebody in Cincinnati, which is ironically where I'm originally from, to try to identify this type of stone. And it was identified as what they call dolostone, which is a part of the Salina limestone group. And if you look at the map here, this yellow band, sort of light yellow band in the middle of the state, is the Salina limestone group, and this dolostone actually outcrops on the south shore of Oneida Lake. So it's a local cargo. It's about 2.5 tons of this rock, that I'm not sure why it was there, because it doesn't seem to have a lot of economic value. It's not positioned right to be ballast. It's kind of weird that it's there, but they were clearly doing something with it. And then in addition to the cargo, we also pulled wood samples. So we took some wood samples from the frames and the bottom planking, both of which were white oak. We took some wood samples from the side planks, which were eastern white pine, and then from the setting pole, which was ash, probably white ash, but we couldn't rule out black ash. And the having white oak for the base and pine for the sides is also indicative of Durham boats, because they're often described as having hardwood bottom planking and softwood side planking, to sort of mix and match durability and lighter weight. And so that, again, sort of little bits of evidence all pointing in this direction. From the site plan, we could then reconstruct the lines of the ship, and lines this is sort of a naval architecture thing, but it's a way to envision the ship in 3 dimensions while only drawing it in 2 dimensions. And so the top one here is if you're looking straight down on the boat, the bow is to the left, the stern is to the right. So the right-hand side, the starboard side of the boat is what's shown here. And because the boats are symmetrical, the left-hand side, the port side, should be the same. But it's showing you sort of almost like topographic lines as you go down into it. And then the lower part here is looking at it from the side, so from the port side looking at it. And again, the dark lines are sort of topographic lines showing you the shape of the hull. And then on the right here, is the left-hand part of this is from the front. So this is the bow and this is the stern. But all of this is basically trying to figure out the shape of the hull. And it's if you like puzzles, this is kind of a fun thing to create, because all the lines have to match to make this work, and they all have to be sort of smooth, because if they're not smooth, the ship couldn't have been planked. But for our purposes, what it allows us to do is to basically create a 3D shape of the hull. And from that, we can figure out the dimensions of it. So for instance, we know that this one was actually 62.5 feet long, which makes a pretty good sized Durham boat. And then it was an even 10 feet wide, and that the sides were 30 inches high. So we get the dimensions of it. We also becomes very clear with this that the bow and the stern are different shapes. So the bow is sort of a little bit more bulbous and more rounded for riding up on things. The stern is actually pretty pointed, and it comes to a much finer point at the back, probably to allow water to flow around the ship or the boat more effectively. The sides and the bottom also it's pretty clear they're flat. This thing's got a flat bottom, and the sides are relatively straight up and down. What was surprising to me, at least, was that there's actually a nice curve to where the sides meet the bottom, what they call a turn of the bilge, where the sides come to the bottom. It's actually got a nice sort of circular curve to it, which I was surprised by. I was expecting much more sort of slab-sided. And from this, you can actually make 3D reconstruction. So here's just a 3D view of some of the frames of it. So it's from the lines, you can make actual true 3-dimensional versions. From the lines, you can also calculate the capacity of the ship, right? So this one had a capacity of about 22 tons. So if you put 22 tons in this boat, it would be floating right at the water line. Like the water would be just lapping over the sides of it, which is a horrible idea. You wouldn't want to do that. Actually, I did that back. If with 22 tons in it, it would actually have a foot of freeboard. So I apologize. When we calculated, we calculated for it to have a foot of the boat sticking out of the water, so it could safely carry 22 tons. Which, if you figure that the weight of the boat itself plus the weight of the crew being about 2 tons, it puts this right pretty close to that 20-ton estimate for the operating capacity of these boats. So again, pointing kind of things starting to line up here. We also could calculate the weight of the cargo at about 5¼ tons, which means that with only 5¼ tons in this boat would have actually had about 2 feet of freeboard. So 24 of its 30 inches would have been sticking out of the water, which basically gives you an idea that even with 5+ tons of rock in this thing, it still only was drawing 6 inches of water, right? So it gives you an idea of how nice these boats were for running on really shallow rivers. So anyways, we can get that with the lines. And then once you have the lines, you can start to reconstruct what the boat would have looked like, right? And so the top image here is, again, looking down on it. The lower part is where the decking, so showing sort of the forward deck and the aft deck and the walking plank along the side that the folks who were pulling it, pushing it along would have walked along this plank. And then on the top part is looking down into the hull, showing all the frames and how the frames were arranged. And then the bottom is looking at it again from the side and looking again at sort of where the frames are. And what this helps us get at is just, again, how this thing would have gone together. In doing this, though, one of the things that became pretty clear, and which again I think is pretty cool, is the frames. If you draw 2 circles that are 30-inch radius, so a 60-inch diameter circle, 2 of them side by side, that's 10 feet, right? Because it's 5 feet and 5 feet. And when you superimpose those circles onto the frames, that the curve of the frame matches that a 5-foot diameter circle perfectly. So it suggests to me that the way that whoever it was who built and designed this boat, for the frames from basically here to here, which is a solid 2/3 of the hull, he probably on the ground on dirt in the ground, put a stick in the ground, and then with a string, a 5-foot string, drew a circle and drew another circle that touched it, and then used that shape to define, to mark out and shape his frames, right? And so with the reconstruction, we start to get into the head of the person who designed this thing, and it begins to explain why it has these sort of really curved sides, because this is a really clean, easy geometrical way to design the shape of this hull. So again, kind of cool. Same with this, again, looking at the shape of the bow and the shape of the stern and thinking about how they would have been used in terms of running this thing up onto ledges and onto the shore, but also trying to keep water and waves from washing into the back as you're going down the river. And also, thinking about how they would have built this thing, because chances are they may have built it upside down so that they could nail those bottom planks into the frames. Again, we're not seeing a lot of nails coming from the inside out, so they would have had to get at the bottom somehow, either up on a trellis or upside down and then flipped it over and put it in the water. But again, thinking about how this thing was built and how they did it. Also thinking a little bit about life on board. There's not a lot on here. There's not a lot of creature comforts, right? I mean, we don't know what was in that jug. It could have been water, could have been Applejack. Don't really know, but there wasn't a lot else on here. I mean, there's a kettle in the front, so it would have been a pretty sparse lifestyle kind of working on this vessel. And then to sort of wrap this up, we did look in the newspapers. We did a newspaper search sort of throughout the early 19th century, trying to put a name to this boat, right, or an owner at least to the boat. And we didn't find any accounts of a Durham boat being lost in Oneida Lake that would have fit this, which does suggest there was no loss of life, at least, which I always find somewhat comforting. But it does leave the question of what happened, right? Was this thing scuttled? Was it lost? I tend to, the picture I've painted in my mind is that they were basically had a light load and they were just trying to get across the lake because it's kind of in the middle of the lake. And they were running across the lake with this light load with a storm coming, figuring with the winds coming up, they could beat it. And they they misjudged horribly, right? And because it does look like it probably sank, and rather than being intentionally lost, which would suggest that whoever was captaining the ship, misjudged Oneida Lake, misjudged his boat, misjudged his skills, or some kind of a combination of these factors that resulted in the loss of this vessel, which was really probably bad luck for him. It's horrible luck for him. But good luck for our understanding of history, right? Because now we have an example of a Durham boat. So when people talk about Durham boats in historical record, we can put something to it, right? And we're also getting a better sense of how these boats, would have been worked, how much cargo they could have held, that kind of stuff, right? The next step in thinking about these boats would be to find other examples. There is some indication in the historical record that the Durham boats in Oneida Lake and in your part of New York are different than the Durham boats on the Delaware River in sort of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. There's a couple of historical accounts where the people talk about them being a little bit different. And also, these are vernacular boats, right? So these are largely being built by independent craftspeople. And each builder would have put their own spin on things, and they also would have modified it for their region and for their clients. So to get a fuller picture of these, we need to find more of them and think about and look at more of them, right? And again, one last time to go back to this 18-wheeler analogy, if you've seen a Mack truck, you have a decent idea of what a Peterbilt looks like, but seeing one doesn't let you know how the other one exactly looks, right? And to understand sort of 18-wheelers or semi-tractor trailers, you got to see all the different makes and models to really truly understand how they all function and what made them all unique. And so that's kind of where we're at now. We got a Peterbilt. Next thing we got to do is find a Mack version, right? And so with that, there's a ton of people that were involved in this, I haven't mentioned all of them in doing this, but they're all on the screen. And like all of archaeology, we talk about archaeology being a social science because you study people, but really it's a social science because you can't do it by yourself. And so, I'm talking, but all of these people contributed a huge amount to this endeavor. Again, in particular, Tim Kaza, Tim Downing, and Chris Martin were instrumental. So with that, I'd be happy to answer questions or hear comments. And thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Ben. This has been incredible.